Hi there, today my presentation will focus on the concept of coloniality of gender, the framework developed by Maria Lagunas. This concept offers a critical lens for understanding the ways in which colonization fundamentally restructured social life and identity. In particular, it highlights how colonial rule imposed a racialized patriarchal gender order that shaped the experience of both men and women in profoundly unequal ways. To explore this concept, I will be analysing Leah Purcell's film The Drover's Wife, The Legend of Molly Johnson. This film provides a powerful case study of how coloniality of gender operated in the Australian frontier. I believe this film was set in the 1890s, and especially in relation to Indigenous women. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this discussion involves sexual violence and coarse language. A quick summary about the film: it reimagines a short story by Henry Lawson and tells it around an Indigenous woman's perspective. Molly Johnson, a pregnant Aboriginal woman living in isolation with her children while her husband is away droving, must defend herself and her family against threats. When she shelters an Aboriginal prisoner, Yadika, their bond reveals shared experiences of survival under colonial violence. The story exposes the brutality of settler society, particularly the racial and gender oppression faced by Indigenous women who are subject to violence, dispossession, and legal injustice. When watching this film, there was a particular scene that left a heavy impact on me, and that was the scene in which Molly Johnson was confronted and assaulted by a group of drovers. The violence she faces is not only personal but structured by colonial power. The drovers treat her as both sexually available and socially disposable, asserting dominance over this woman's body. Their assault reinforces how frontier violence targeted Indigenous women as symbols of colonial control to be exploited or eliminated. I would like to note that this image on the slide is not a clip from the scene, as I found the image too disturbing. However, I would not deter anyone from watching this film, as it is not whitewashed and it showcases a true story experienced by Indigenous women. Lagunas argues that colonization did not simply overlay existing societies, but restructured them through the imposition of modern/colonial gender system in which race and gender were fused as an inseparable axis of domination. This gender system produced a light side, where bourgeois women and men were cast as fragile, pure, confined to domestic reproduction, and a dark side, in which Indigenous colonized women were constructed as hypersexual, exploitive, and included from the protections of gendered womanhood. Through Molly Johnson's experience of violence, motherhood, and survival, the film exemplifies how colonialism imposed racialized gender hierarchies, fractured Indigenous kinships, and legitimized violence against Aboriginal women, while also offering moments of resilience and defiance. Lagunas builds upon Annabelle Quijano's concept of coloniality of power, which describes how colonization created four enduring dimensions that existed through sex, labor, authority, and subjectivity. She expands this to argue that gender, as imposed under colonial modernity, was not universal, but specifically heterosexualist, patriarchal, and racialized. Under this system, colonized women were denied the status of women altogether, and instead treated as sexual and labor resources to be exploited by white men. Molly Johnson's story embodies this double subjugation and intersectionality between being Aboriginal and female. The violence and sexual exploitation Molly faces enacts the colonial fantasy Lagunas describes. The Indigenous women are assumed to be sexually available and socially disposable, denied the protections often accorded to white women. Although I do believe white women often face violence inflicted by men, I think that upon colonization of Australia, Indigenous women were viewed as inferior and thus treated as this inferior to white women and were unfairly subjugated to patriarchal abuse. This can be cited in the film when one of the drovers sneers at Molly, "No one's here to protect you, black B-word," framing her both through racial and gender, outside the boundaries of law and morality. Just as Lagunas argues, sexual violence against colonized women was not incidental but foundational to colonial power. Molly's assault is depicted as both a personal violation and structural domination through colonial power. Molly's role as a mother also reflects the colonial restructuring of gender. Despite her resilience and care, colonial authorities treat her motherhood with suspicion, casting her as immoral, unstable, and ultimately criminal. When Sergeant Klintoff investigates her, he questions whether Molly can even be considered a fit mother. under settler law. Molly's anguished cry, "They take our children, call us unfit, then leave us to rot," captures the reality of how Indigenous women were stripped of maternal legitimacy. This echoes Laguna's claim that coloniality fractured Indigenous kinship systems by denying Aboriginal women recognition as mothers and carers. Here we understand that white women were idealised as reproducers of race and nation, and Indigenous women's motherhood was undermined and erased. This is as depicted when Molly's children were called octoroons and to be removed from her family. This reflects realistic stories as unfolded through the stolen generations, where Aboriginal children were taken from their families to be assimilated into white homes and Christianized and stripped of their culture. Molly's relationship with Yadika further illustrates the intermeshing of race and gender. Yadika helps Molly to unlock her Aboriginal identity and understanding of her Indigenous heritage. This leads to her self-discovery and embrace of her identity. The film depicts her journey of coming to terms with reclaiming this part of her heritage, making her Aboriginal identity integral to the narrative. Once others find out about her heritage, she is immediately punished for it through the removal of her children. Yadika is criminalised as a threatening Aboriginal man. However, he is just criminalised because he was a black man, as seen in the quote, "My crime misses existing whilst black." Their bond suggests, however, the possibility of forms of kinship and mutual recognition outside of colonial categories. In this sense, Molly's position in The Drover's Wife reflects what Lagunas describes as the systemic reduction of colonised women to resources, bodies marked for exploitation and exclusion from womanhood itself. Lagunas describes the colonial gender system as split into two sides. The light side, which is reserved for white women and men. Women were idealised as pure, fragile, and reproducers of the nation. Men were cast as rational, authoritative, and property-owning. The dark side is applied to colonised peoples. Colonised women were excluded from true womanhood, seen as hypersexual, available for labour and sexual exploitation, and denied maternal legitimacy. Colonised men were cast as irrational, animalistic, criminal, and hypersexual, denied access to patriarchal authority or economic independence. This dark side justified colonial domination by depicting Indigenous peoples as outside civilization, law, and morality in itself. Key point: the light and dark sides are not separate, but coexistent. The dignity, purity, and domesticity of white women depended on the racialized disposability of Indigenous women. The dark side is displayed in the film through Molly's assault and removal of her children. The light side is displayed, even though not obvious. Settler women in the film were portrayed as more protected and socially valued. They benefit from colonial law and are insulated by definitions of respectability. The very protections denied to Molly were precisely those afforded to white women because of their position on the light side of gender. By viewing The Drover's Wife through Laguna's framework, the film can be read as a cultural text that depicts the coloniality of gender, both highlighting the following dynamics: intersectionality of race and gender. For Molly, oppression cannot be reduced either as gender or race. She is targeted because she is an Aboriginal woman, and suffering cannot be explained without acknowledging the intersection Lagunas identifies. Law and violence. Lagunas shows that the colonial gender system was inseparable from the coloniality of power. The law itself was racialized and patriarchal. Similarly, the film depicts how settler law legitimizes violence against Aboriginal women when criminalizing their resistance. Clintoff's refusal to recognise Molly's testimony reflects Laguna's claim that colonised women were excluded from the very category of women. Disruption of Indigenous gender systems. Lagunas notes that many pre-colonial societies were non-binary or more egalitarian, with women holding spiritual and communal authority. The film hints at this disruption through Molly's independence and her bond with Yadika, which suggest relational possibilities beyond settler patriarchy. Now, despite the violence Molly suffers, she also resists the colonial gender order. Her act of defiance against both the drovers and the colonial law reject the roles imposed upon her as wife, mother, and Aboriginal woman under settler patriarchy. In one of the film's most powerful lines, Molly declares, "I'll protect my children, even if it kills me." This refusal to submit exemplifies Laguna's call for women of colour to, quote, reject this gender system as we perform transformation of communal relations. Molly's final choices, though tragic, represent a refusal to kind of play into the coloniality of gender and gestures towards Indigenous resilience and survival. This film provides a powerful case study of Laguna's theory of coloniality of gender. The film illustrates how colonialism imposed a racialized patriarchal system in which Indigenous women were excluded from the category of women denied maternal legitimacy and subjugated to sexual violence. Laguna's framework helps us see Molly's suffering not as isolated but as part of a broader structure of domination that fused race and gender into inseparable axes of oppression. At the same time, both Laguna's and the film insist on the importance of resistance, Molly's defiance, like Laguna's calls, to reject allegiance and the colonial gender system. Gestures toward the possibility of reasserting Indigenous ways of being and rebuilding communal authority.